This is the center of a new unified Germany. Berlin, Germany's glittering capital. It's the best of up-to-the-minute modern architecture, contrasted with classical and traditional survivals. Today's Berlin is also a city reasserting its identity as one of the world's most cosmopolitan towns. Berlin's population is 3.5 million, but almost 500,000 of them come from elsewhere, from 195 countries at last count. Its many languages make the town sound like the United Nations. This is the New Berlin, positioning itself to be one of the great cultural feasts of the 21st century. At the close of World War II, Berlin was practically one vast cinder. It was the last holdout of the Third Reich. The city was hammered by Allied bombers and finally overrun by the Red Army. Out of the desolation came long, bleak decades of partition as the Cold War dividing line, the Berlin Wall, sliced through the center of the city. East versus West, communism versus capitalism. The gap started here. This unrelenting division prevented the city from regaining the cultural and economic prominence it once enjoyed. Now it's clear that Berlin has re-emerged from the ashes. And the greatest step in that direction was taken in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. Today, a mile-long stretch of the original wall is preserved as an outdoor gallery of graffiti art, including this famous parody of a car ad, which suggests that the ultimate test for any new car would be to escape from oppression. It's art as social commentary. This area is now the most redeveloped piece of property in the world. This is Potsdamer Platz, once cut in half by the wall. Now it's ground zero for the rebirth of Berlin. It's got the new Sony Center, with its tent-like central atrium. Still, traditional architecture is never far off in Berlin. In one corner of Potsdamer Platz is the Kaisersaal, the Hall of the Emperor. It's been reconstructed under a protective skin of glass, so the old class and confidence of the limestone can shine through. In its glory days, this was a grand hotel, but it too succumbed to the war's onslaught. Inside, the redesign centers on the shell of the walls that survived. Once a favorite haunt of Kaiser Wilhelm, these rooms have seen their share of pomp and circumstance. Its resurrection adds a touch of old-world class to the square. The Kaiser would have approved. Another tale of Berlin reborn centers around the old Adlon Hotel. In the 1920s, after World War I, inflation took hold and prices and wages increased. But Berlin prospered. The rich and cultured, especially those who had fled Russia after the revolution, resettled here. At this time, Berlin's culture was at its peak. The greatest writers and artists from all over Europe once drank their coffee and read the papers in this very room. It was a time when the intelligentsia were celebrities. In these very rooms, people tried to put their lives back together in the aftermath of war. From these same rooms today, you can still see many of the famous sights the city has to offer. In the center of the city stands the Siegessäule, or Triumphal Column of 1873. With its image of the goddess of victory atop, the column was meant to celebrate the end of the European wars of the 1860s and 70s. The Brandenburg Gate is perhaps the most recognized image of Berlin. This is one of what were once 18 gates through the old fortifications of the medieval city. This is a neoclassical version of a triumphal gate akin to those in Rome, Paris, and London. It went up in 1795. Its quadriga, a Roman war chariot drawn by 4 horses, was actually removed by a victorious Napoleon and taken to Paris. A few years on, it was returned and still stands here today. The Brandenburg Gate stands in what was once East Germany. What's hard to understand about the crippling geography of the Cold War is that the Berlin Wall was never a singular, linear dividing line between East and West. Instead, the barrier was more or less circular, about 96 miles long. It ran completely around the whole of West Berlin, cutting it off not only from East Berlin, but from the rest of East Germany as well. That is, if you stepped out of West Berlin in any direction, you stepped into East Germany. Old West Berlin is most easily seen in its main street, the Kurfürstendamm. With its upmarket fashion houses, it represents the height of Western market economics. Karl Marx Boulevard, as the name suggests, was once meant to be seen as the center of communist East Berlin when the area was redeveloped after 1961. The streets behind Karl Marx Boulevard are a warren of older buildings now being refurbished. Trendy shops and ethnic eateries are attracting a younger and hipper crowd than ever before. And every old building is a potential site for a clever conversion into posh flats. Despite the undeniable pain and disruption, and the human toll caused by the Berlin Wall, several segments still stand in places around the city. Though it is hard history, the wall is nevertheless history, and Germany is determined to preserve this part of its past. The biggest threats to the wall nowadays are souvenir hunters, people who want to chip away their own little piece of history. Some sections have in fact collapsed after too many bits of the wall were carried off. This is Friedrichstrasse, a major thoroughfare. So important was this street that where it pierced the wall, there was once a passport control point known the world over as Checkpoint Charlie. Its name is American military slang for the letter C. This Checkpoint Charlie is in fact a replica of the original security hut. From 1961 to 1989, all foreigners driving into and out of East Germany had to present their papers here. It's hard to imagine But World War III almost started right here in 1961, as American and Russian tanks came barrel to barrel. "45 years later, what started out as tragedy is now another photo op for tourists. Here, too, is one of the most popular cultural sites in Berlin, the house at Checkpoint Charlie. A museum dedicated to the history of the wall. It's a storehouse of tales of escape and daring associated with the old divided city and nation. The museum was the creation of Rainer Hildebrandt. Hildebrandt spent his life helping people escape to the West. The museum is a tribute to their endurance, resilience, and pluck. Secret compartments in cars, special suitcases, the space between two sailboards, or hot air balloons. All these were part of the exit strategy back in the day. But failed escapes were often met with imprisonment or death. Only desperation could have made people think these devices would work. Plainly, the Wall Museum at Checkpoint Charlie proves the adage that necessity is truly the mother of invention. Alexandra Hildebrandt is a curator at her husband's museum.
There is not a single artifact in the museum that is not intimately connected with the people who escaped over the wall, or the people who helped them escape. They donated all these things so that they'd never be forgotten. These aren't just things, they're important witnesses to a very sad point in time. These are their own personal artifacts. These were people who were desperate to escape communism and live in a free society. And these things show how desperate they were. 2 families escaped in a hot air balloon, like this one behind me. Recently, the very children who escaped as youngsters returned as adults to look again at their place in history. Such a moving experience. This museum is a picture of life, frozen forever exactly as it was.
Books about the fall of communism will always be important, but nothing captures and preserves the determination and willpower of people who risked their lives like these exhibits. Part of the East-West barrier was an open area, a free fire zone, where would-be escapees could be picked off by sharpshooters. There were landmines here, and weed killer was used to prevent the growth of cover. Today, however, nature has returned. There are so many symbols hereabouts, and most are to do with the frailty of human judgment. The city also set up this monument to the reunification. The sculpture evokes the idea of forgiveness, and below, the Book of Truth lies unfettered once again. Just beyond is the ultra-modern Cappella der Versöhnung, the Chapel of Reconciliation. It stands on the very spot where an old parish church once stood, but it had to be demolished to clear the death zone. On Mühlenstrasse is the East Side Gallery, which is actually a section of the wall handed over to artists. This long gallery runs for about a mile and is completely covered with paintings. As soon as the city was reunited when the wall came down in 1989, artists and locals once again came out into the light and felt safe expressing themselves. Overall, more than half the wall is gone, and in some places, it's weathering badly. And what was once expected to be part of an impregnable fortress is now an art exhibit. Still, the wall is mainly a symbol now, and so its reduced state is perfect for its message about the limits and abuse of power. One of the original artists here was Kani Aravi. Years ago, he came to Berlin from Iran to study art. This is the painting he did just after the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
I painted this picture in February 1990. On the historical day itself, on November 9th, 1989, I was at Checkpoint Charlie. It represents that very day in my life, emotionally and physically. What I really witnessed. I saw all these people rushing through Checkpoint Charlie, crying and laughing, and those images are embedded in my mind. I never wanted to forget that day, that feeling. So I got to work and sketched the whole thing before painting. Look at the faces, and you'll see that some were delighted, but some were very, very sad, apprehensive. They didn't know what to expect, and it was both sides who had no idea how it would all work out. This picture expresses the power of that moment, the bewilderment, the exhilaration. These were painted just before the wall fell. They're very old and very much worn down. Unlike my pictures on the wall, this section needs to be preserved in the right way. Otherwise, it will just continue to deteriorate. The wall must be saved so that new paintings can be added, paintings that will last. We can see the steel rebars rusting and sticking out, just here. It's like a collapsing skeleton. This is our skeleton, and it's no longer in the closet. All this needs to be saved.
But nowhere is the city's revival more apparent than in the Mitte district, the center of the city. In the old, almost medieval atmosphere of Mitte's streets and courtyards, the past is palpable. In modern cities, the streets are rectangular and cross each other in regular and predictable ways. It's easy to find your way about. But the regularity and openness is something that modern city planners have insisted on. And not just in Berlin. Cities do not grow like that naturally. Instead, they more often resemble this, an unpredictable mixture of narrow ways and blind alleys. A neighborhood like this is a history textbook. Some of these buildings, which have reconstructed exteriors and look 19th or 20th century, may in fact have 17th century structures hidden inside, or medieval vaults in their basements. Neighborhoods like Mitte can be found all across Europe. But there is also another poignant story that these streets hold. Prior to World War II, this portion of Mitte was the site of a Jewish graveyard. Under the Nazis, the graves were removed and the Mitte was appropriated by the Reich. On the wall surrounding the old graveyard, a silent plaque details the unspeakable events. But even among such horrors, there are still tiny points of light. This site honors the memory of a single German, Otto Weitz, who sheltered a blind Jew for the duration of the war. It's the Anne Frank saga all over again, and in the heart of Berlin. Today, Mitte is the place to be and is wildly popular with the young, like Greenwich Village or Georgetown in the States. You can take a stroll through Mitte at almost any time of day and find something that catches your eye. Its streets are lined with shoe shops, designer stores, cafes, restaurants, and theaters. There's never a shortage of things to do. And at night, Mitte transforms itself once again into the hippest place on Earth. Alexanderplatz, the center of Old East Berlin, is another neighborhood that's undergoing vast changes. Harold Hauswald, an eminent photographer, was born and raised in East Berlin. Over the last 25 years, his pictures have documented the changes in the area and its people. Today, Hauswald is part of a movement to make sure the plans for the new Alexanderplatz include the wishes of the local residents. The fact is that some people want no changes to the neighborhood, probably because redevelopment so often means the new version will be better for cars and architecture, but less so for living. Hauswald and his pictures are proof that change is a good thing, and he's determined to get his message out there. His photographic studio is right on Alexanderplatz.
This is a picture of Oranienburgstrasse, with the wall still standing. It's a classic old East German neighborhood. The photo's from the mid-80s, but it looks like the war just ended, because they've done nothing. There wasn't much change in this neighborhood. But here's a recent picture of the same spot. There's quite an improvement. On the left, here was the post office. Now it's a huge art installation. Can you see? Because it was once a post office, they've stuck love letters all over it. That was a beautiful thing to do.
His pictures don't just cover the changes in buildings, but in people as well.
In Old East Germany, they had an educational group called the Free German Youth. This was a picture of one of their last gatherings, just after Easter in spring 1989, 6 months before the wall fell. It was a concert in the Schlossplatz in East Germany.
Recently, Hauswald took this picture in the same place. The rows of washing machines were part of a campaign whose slogan was, "To wash away the dirty state of politics."
This is a photo of a part of Prenzlauerberg, where I grew up. Here, children are playing amongst the rubble in the ruins. It still looks like it did shortly after the war, which is pathetic.
Berlin has clearly seen some tough times, and Hauswald has been documenting them. Because sometimes the redevelopment efforts don't always go right.
After unification, in this very same spot, they tore a house down and made a little park. But children don't play there anymore. It's mainly empty. Something odd there. They made it too sterile.
This photo of a watchtower right along the wall was taken by Hauswald and his daughter. The picture was confiscated by the Tower Guards, but Hauswald recently managed to get it back.
This was May Day, 1987, 2 years before the wall ended. This was always the most important communist festival, but as soon as it began to rain, people ran home. It was the beginning of the end. Back then, the Brandenburg Gate was the end of the earth to us. This photo really takes me back. Looking toward the west, we knew this world was over for us. This is the Brandenburg Gate on November 4th, 1989, the historic day. Strange, but it's the only picture I took on the day when my life changed completely. It was a very moving day.
This turned out to be the most famous image of the end of communist East Germany. The brave new world was about to begin. Hauswald's pictures of the New Berlin have been collected in a volume entitled Zeitenwechsel, Pictures Since the Change, since the wall came down.
Das ist ein Foto von Werner Mahler.
A friend and colleague took this on November 9th, 1989.
Das Foto hat er am 9. November direkt am Tag der Maueröffnung gemacht.
When I could finally go to West Berlin, it was the most memorable day of my life. And right after I crossed through the wall, I bumped into a friend who'd escaped 13 years earlier. We just hugged, and both of us cried.
Far from running away from the undeniable pain of those 30 years, Hauswald mines his personal story to enhance his art.
I've taken Berlin pictures for years now, and what I think these days is that I've really come through something amazing. After Unity in 1989, my whole world opened up. I got my driver's license in 1991, and now West Berlin is very familiar to me. The East German communists made our world into a prison. Now I can really understand just how bad it was. Now we can think freely. Before, we were told what and how to think. Life has become more difficult, though. The government isn't taking care of us all the time. There is room to fail. But now, I meet so many more people, and that's priceless. This is how it should be.
Und von daher geht es mir natürlich wesentlich besser.
Hauswald and his pictures are today a treasure to all Berliners. He has been officially commended for documenting the great change that is still underway, and which Hauswald is still shooting. When we return, Berlin goes to the movies, and we go with it, with the city that was Hollywood before there was a Hollywood. Berlin is as modern a city as any on Earth. But would there be a modern world as we know it without the cinema? For the Berlin story is also the story of the origins of the cinema as art. Without Berlin, motion picture history would be far different and poorer. Since the earliest days of film, Germans in general and Berliners in particular have been central to photography and motion pictures. And this is one of the great movie museums in the world, the Berlin Film Museum. It's a tribute not only to the technology and machinery of filmmaking, but also its celebrities. The Oscar of Emil Jannings, who was the first person to win an Oscar for acting in 1928. Jannings also starred with the great Marlene Dietrich in her most celebrated role, The Blue Angel. Dietrich's life, 1901 to 1992, almost exactly coincides with the birth, growth, and burgeoning of the worldwide film industry. Marlene was a great devotee of German film history, and so her family donated her personal collection of memorabilia to the museum in her memory. This is the letter Marlene wrote to the director Josef von Sternberg, who was the first person to cast her in a role in the 1930 hit The Blue Angel. Von Sternberg went on to direct almost 20 Hollywood films, dying in California in 1969. Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang, is a 1927 film predicting the future of Berlin. It's a vision of a world gone wrong, with workers living below ground and the thinkers living above. Trouble is, there is no heart between these extremes of muscle and mind. In some cases, Berlin itself stars in movies. In Run Lola Run, as the heroine dashes around the city, one of the great pleasures for Berliners is to say, "I know where that is." A great many German films have been shot at the Babelsberg Studio in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. This is the oldest large-scale film studio in the world, with 16 shooting stages covering 270,000 square feet. Jan Schlubach is an art director and producer. Among other things, he worked on a number of Oscar-winning Stanley Kubrick movies. Today, Schlubach is being interviewed by a journalist working on the city's fabled movie-making past.
My first film project was as artistic director for the film Barry Lyndon. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick. We built the sets in 3 days. It was a big push to get it done back in 1972. After that, I worked on a number of films as artistic director. Then I worked on a TV hospital drama. It was very popular in Germany. The public was attracted by the attention to detail and the realism inside the hospital. One of the great things was that people said that it looked so real, that you could walk in there and have an operation right now. You know, one of the most recognizable characteristics of a hospital is the hallways, the long hallways. But because we had such a large soundstage, it was easy to make one that was 150 feet long. I mean, you can't have hospital drama without doctors and nurses rushing up and down a corridor. We duplicated an actual hospital and a huge set, just like the real thing. We used real medical gear too, which cost thousands of marks.
Inside the Babelsberg lot, this is the set of the Academy Award-winning film, The Pianist. It's meant to be seen as Warsaw, made of styrofoam and wood, supported from behind by steel frames. On film, it couldn't be more realistic, when in fact it's all pretend. In a way, it's like Hollywood itself, where surface counts far more than substance. Schlubach has spent many a day and night on this lot. He clearly revels in recapturing this part of his past.
This building was a factory, originally built in 1890. In it, they once made artificial flowers. It was then converted into a studio. In those days, the backside was all glass, because the sun was our main light source.
In the 1930s, the golden age of German film began right here.
This is where they shot the remarkable silent film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a 1919 horror film about a murderous sleepwalker who kills in the night. Very scary. Over there was the wardrobe department and the cafeteria. And upstairs were the film production offices.
Wieland Speck is one of the directors of the Berlin Film Festival. To him, Berlin is a major player in cinema history.
Berlin and films are inseparable. As in all art, we look to the past in order to go forward. You always have to come up with new ideas. So this museum was built to keep the past alive and preserve the memories of great Berlin artists like Fritz Lang and von Sternberg. When they were still working, Berlin was the capital of the film world. Then with communism, the competition between East and West dragged us down a bit. But after the wall came down, the film industry in Berlin was booming once again.
One of the greatest films that starred Berlin was Der Himmel über Berlin, The Heaven Above Berlin, also known as Wings of Desire, directed by Wim Wenders. In it, the great German actor Otto Sander played the angel Cassiel who returned to Earth. For the last 40 years, Sander has been a film and television star, but he's also an unofficial ambassador from Berlin to the rest of the world. It hasn't always been easy. But Berlin has survived and come back to the place it knew it was in the past, a great city for human interaction. To that end, Otto Sander's favorite poem is perfect for Berlin. It's called Eyes in the Big City by Kurt Tucholsky, who died in exile in 1935.
Wenn du zur Arbeit gehst am frühen Morgen, wenn du am Bahnhof stehst mit deinen Sorgen, da zeigt die Stadt dir
So, off you go to work. You stand in the station weighed down by woes, and suddenly, from out of the black asphalt, a million faces funnel toward you, and then two strange eyes, one blink. Brow, pupils, lids, what was that? Only the chance of a lifetime. Past, fled, never to come again. In your life you travel 1,000 streets, and along the way are all the things you forgot. An eye that once winked, a soul that once rang a bell. And by God, there it is again, for one fleeting second. What was that? The past, fled, never to come again. You must, as you wander through the city, probe into every heart. This one a foe, that a friend, a potential comrade forever. And this may just be the very one. Two sad eyes, one blink, brow, pupils, lids. What was that? It's the past, fled and gone forever.
The poem celebrates the city as a place of possibility, where some see only loneliness and fear, others see friendship and a new future. Cities like Berlin are what we crave as humans, a place to find love and work in the company of people who share our concerns. People who can make us better, make us bigger, and give us utterly new ideas. We often think of cities as vast economic engines, a place where everyone is buying or selling something. And that's true, but it's a pitifully small part of what makes cities important, and what makes Berlin great. The real benefit of cities is the people, that critical mass of thinkers and writers and ordinary citizens pressing for revitalization and new growth. It's the culture of the coffee houses and newspapers and journals, of shop windows and small market entrepreneurs. You don't get all that in smaller, less populous rural areas. In Berlin, you do. Cities are by definition open to new ideas. They continually evolve and change, driven by all those minds at work. All sorts of minds, with all sorts of plans for the future. What is the city but the people? A great writer once asked. Berlin certainly has the people, plus a deep and tragic history from which it is only just coming round. It's got the traditions, the art, the architecture, and the movies. But it's Berliners that make it all worthwhile.